Is mid-century Indian modernism still relevant today? When we look at the question of the legacy of mid-century modernism, and not just of India, but of the whole world, we are faced with a contradiction. On the one hand, it seems absolutely clear that the mid-century moment is long gone and past and become obsolete. We see this certainly in the architecture, when a lot of buildings of that era are being destroyed or reworked. But we also see this in the political sphere, where the politics and ethics of that era are considered to have run their course and become obsolete and a thing of the past. But on the other hand, when we look at some of the aesthetic production of that era, we find that the art and, for instance, the furniture of the mid-century moment is greatly treasured and sold and collected and possessed in museums and collections around the world for fantastic prices. And it is also true that as we face the climate crisis and the other environmental challenges that we are confronting today, the mid-century obsession with thinking about the energy crisis, with thinking about new ways of building and living, with thinking from a high altitude about how human civilization could be organized, that question of large-scale planning seems to increasingly again be coming to the fore as we try and imagine a future in which we are living in a manner that is harmonious with the exigencies of our planet. In other words, the jury on the relevance of mid-century modernism is still out. We will use my recently published book, One Continuous Line, The Art, Architecture and Urbanism of Aditya Prakash as a starting point, but our conversation should be wide-ranging and hopefully interesting and provocative.
Hello and welcome, everybody. My name is Vikram Prakash, and I am host of Architecture Talk podcast, and I'm also Associate Dean for Academic Affairs in the College of Built Environments at the University of Washington here in Seattle. And it is my pleasure to be moderating today's discussion. And I'm also the author of One Continuous Line, The Art, Architecture, and Urbanism of Aditya Prakash, which is a starting point of our conversation, but certainly we will try and go well beyond it. On this topic of is mid-century modernism relevant today, I'm joined by four fantastic scholars. I'll introduce them briefly and hopefully they will jump into the screen. Alphabetically by their first names. Tony, thank you. You're already live and I could see you. Anthony Vidler is professor and dean emeritus of the Irwin S. Channon School of Architecture of the Cooper Union. He's a historian and a critic of modern and contemporary architecture and has published widely, of course, from the French Enlightenment to the present, which includes an extensive array of books from topics like the architectural uncanny, warped spaces, and histories of the immediate present. And we have had so many conversations on this topic. I'm looking forward to today's conversation with you, Tony. Second on the panel is Mark Jarzombek. Mark is professor of history and theory at the MIT School of Architecture. Besides being a Renaissance scholar, Mark is today one of the leading advocates of global history. Is also published prolifically. He has written a lot of books and papers, including, of course, the groundbreaking textbook, A Global History of Architecture, which, of course, I've had the great pleasure of co-authoring with Mark amongst the many projects that we have worked on together. So Tony is in New York City. Mark's actually, I think, down in Florida. Next on my list over here is Partha Mitter. Partha, you are in London. Where are you?
No, I'm in Oxford.
In Oxford. Partha is, of course, well known in the art history circles. He's Professor Emeritus of the University of Sussex. He's a historian of art and culture, specializing in the reception of Indian art in the West, and most recently in global modernism. Of course, some of his texts are iconic and well established in the history of South Asian art history. Amongst these, from his long list of publications, I want to in particular point out his book, 1977 book, Much Maligned Monsters, which inaugurated a whole genre, I would argue, of colonial and post-colonial art history scholarship. But of course, his recent work on cosmopolitanism and related issues is something that we will be probably taking up a lot more now. And finally, we have Sunil Khilnani, who is, I think, in DC, in Washington, DC. He's professor of politics and history now at Ashoka University. He's the scholar of Indian history and, of course, very well known, but perhaps best known as the author of The Idea of India, which became a bestseller. And I remember I first encountered it in the railway stations of India. So that's when I picked up the idea of India. And I thought, oh yeah, I get what he's talking about. And that became a book which was very well established. So that's our panel. I want to say right away off that we are hoping to do more panels in the coming months. Maristella Casciato, the fantastic scholar of modernism who wrote the foreword for the book, and I will be on another panel in October, which we'll have a slightly different flavor. And then hopefully sometime next year, we will have another panel with a series of Indian scholars, more particularly from the discipline of architecture. So these things are coming up. But today we are looking forward to a rich and robust conversation. So let's get this conversation going. All right, is everybody here and ready? The thing to point out is that why this group of people? Well, for the very simple reason, these are the four people who were generous enough to provide an endorsement on the back cover of the book. I thank you for that. And that is, in a sense, the logic. Now you got to show up and explain what you were thinking when you provided that endorsement. But we'll try and have this as a broader conversation. So, is mid-century Indian modernism or mid-century modernism in general relevant today? That's the question. We are trying to put, I suppose, a comparison between a aesthetic, social, and political effort that can be said to have occurred not just in India, but around the world, roughly, let's say, from 1950 to 1970-ish. And we are trying to ask that today, in the second decade of the 21st century, is that moment 50, 60 years ago of any continued relevance? And this question, of course, comes up because, of course, a lot of mid-century architecture is being destroyed today for questions of obsolescence and also questions of political interests of various kinds. So should we preserve a few buildings, and how should we preserve them? And what indeed is the legacy of that moment is the question at hand. And I want to begin off by having set these two moments up. I thought one way to begin is, and maybe, I don't know, maybe Tony, you can talk about this. I remember growing up between those two moments in India in the 1970s. All right. And in India, in the 70s, two things seemed very strong. One was that modernism, modern architecture in particular, seemed to be under attack. Or rather, it was not under attack, but it was being strongly critiqued by a series of postmodern imperatives, right? There was this critique of its aesthetics and its claim to universality. And there was a critique of sociality, of its location. And today, in 2021, there is a different kind of a critique of mid-century and early modernism. So I wonder if that's a good place to begin, at least in the architectural sphere. And of course, then we can turn in a moment to the political sphere, which also was under critique in the 70s and 80s. What, Tony, do you think is the difference between the 70s moment, and I invite, I've already told all the panelists, feel free to join in as you like. What do you think is the difference between that moment in the 70s? What was those critiques of modernism about as compared to what we perhaps are seeing today?
Well, I have to say that the critique of modernism, in my experience, was an emerging phenomenon, certainly in Britain, almost immediately after the close of the Second World War. It was a critique which was based on a critique of technology, the Holocaust and the atomic bomb. It was a critique that began to evaluate socially the questions of exclusion and zoning built into the CIAM, or the Congress of International Modern Architecture, Athens Charter. It was a critique that felt that the reductivist aesthetics of the immediate pre-war period, the abstractionist aesthetics, were not involved in anything to do with popular appreciation. And that critique, I think, built out of Team 10 with the Smithsons, and out of a whole range of questions that, on the one hand, criticized the technological enthusiasm of modernity, certainly with the Smithsons, and certainly with a lot of architects who began to look more at the materials of construction. And then there was a critique that the technological aspirations of modernity hadn't been satisfied. So we have people like Rayner Banham and Buckminster Fuller and Cedric Price in Britain. So the critiques that you received in India in the 70s had already been well, if you like, formulated by the 70s, and were at the same time being inflected by an aesthetic critique of one form of abstraction or another, whether it was brutalist abstraction or modernist abstraction, which began to look at the ways that architecture might connect more to its own history. And so we get the historicizing postmodernisms that Baird and Jenks proposed in their 67 Meaning in Architecture book. So I think that there are two stages to the critique. And I think neither of them were deeply involved in the kinds of critiques that we are involved in today. Neither of them seem to, except very peripherally, in terms of solar energy being experimented occasionally. But electricity was still thought of as the great boon of mankind.
As the solution, as the answer,
As the solution. And therefore, there was no real critique of the infrastructural questions that now we talk about. There was no critique of the predominantly Western-based ideological framing of the practice of architecture, the discipline of architecture. And there was almost no critique at all of the neo-imperialist post-imperial spread of Western architecture disciplinary apparatus. So I think we have a lot to talk about, and especially in terms of the environment, where we had a very brief environmental fling in the 70s in Europe.
Early 70s,
during the gas crisis, but that went straight under the bridge in favor of historicist postmodernism.
Let's come to the climate and the energy crisis in a moment. But Partha, perhaps I can turn to you in a moment for a moment, if it's okay.
Right.
And since Tony brought up this all these critiques of modernism, which were already in extant in the 50s, 60s, certainly from architecture, we think of Team 10 and so on. Often what we heard as a young student of architecture in the 70s, we were subjected to the idea, well, modernism, it was a Western import, right? A kind of a post-colonial, neo-colonial hangover of the Nehruvian era, and echoes of those ideas are all still present here today. But you have tried to describe. So, what is your reading of that critique, and what is your reading of mid-century modernism, especially in terms of ideas? I think you have written about cosmopolitanism. I wonder if you want to pick up on that.
Okay. Well, I see modernism as a discourse, a specific discourse, which emerged in late 19th century, early 20th century Europe, America a little later. But modernity is a wider issue. Now, there is an interesting connection, as we all know, between these vast changes, communication revolution, travel, and other forms of, real great changes brought about by colonial rule, not directly by them often, but certainly the whole thing, the impetus got very strong at that time. The thing is that, so related to that, I want to make it a bit wider, also bring in the problem of, if we can call it art and architecture, they're, very related. Now,
for sure, yeah.
The problem is, you see, what's interesting is that what you find that colonialism and nationalism are very closely woven. I mean, there's no question.
Yeah.
And the early period of 20th century, not the mid-century, but you have this sort of nationalist struggle and this kind of continuous interface of colonialism and nationalism, and it led to art and not so much architecture, if I'm correct, but you might correct me on that. But what then happens is very interesting. Let's take Nehruvian period, because that's where we have
that's our focus. We definitely
absolutely. What is interesting is that you have related to let's say Nehru's own dreams about a transforming society, which would be secular, modern, society, and leave all the previous terrible things behind. Now, the interesting thing about it is it has also links with science, the teleology, the continuous linear history, that it goes on and on, both in science and art. Both have tremendous problems, but let me not come to that yet. So this period, can I say that 47 is a very important date, not just for India. That is the beginning of the process of decolonization. And a whole lot of countries come into it. So this, shall we say, 50s and 60s, because by 70s, a lot of critiques started happening. But this is a very, I call it, it's a great optimistic period. Everything can happen, it's possible. So Nehru asked Corbusier to come to India. Well, there are also, tremendous kind of interest in America, particularly architects. I mean, so many disciples of Lloyd Wright, Alan Stein, Joseph Alan Stein, Ray and Charles, they come in, they interact. Now, what I'm trying to say is that this is a period where there is no questioning of the whole project of modernism. It's very, very forward-looking. There were unfortunate problems within that, and that is why by the 70s, greater critics start happening. But one thing I have to say, to me, to my mind, late 70s is a very different period. Now, all the way from 47 to the late 60s, you have critiques of capitalism, but these are always within the Western teleological framework. There's no challenging. And postcolonialism, postmodernism begin to challenge that. And that actually has a lot of impact on, eventually, on art and other aspects. Does that make sense? So the next period is a period of rethinking and kind of, that's another interesting period. I mean,
but one of the interesting things, Partha, isn't it, that in the 50s and 60s, at the time, Tony, as you were saying, in a lot of Western discourse, there were significant critiques of modernism being launched, coming out of the complex experience of World War II. The interesting thing is, modernism, in a sense, modern architecture, takes off in Chandigarh, in Islamabad, in Dhaka, in Tel Aviv, in Brasilia, a little earlier, but also in, if you want, Canberra and Ankara. It sort of becomes an important thing as a part of the post-colonial world. So go ahead, Partha.
Yeah, but the thing is that I do believe that these critiques were within the Western canon. There's no real questioning. It doesn't go beyond that. So you have a kind of hierarchy, which is challenged increasingly.
Yeah. What is the relationship between all these, let's say, Western critiques and the post-colonial, can we say, embrace of modernism? Is that a fair? Are they just separated, or is there?
You already mentioned postmodern, Jenks and others, but there's the post-colonial aspect. These are working well. They take modernism and all the other aspects, and they critique, and the critiques are very different. But you see, before that, I mean, there are so many very important figures. Rosalind Krauss, for instance, challenging the idea of originality of the avant-garde. But they never actually grapple with the problem of non-West and its own issues. So that, I think, is a very fundamental difference from the late 70s, 80s.
And I think, Partha, you're absolutely right in saying that the critiques I talked about immediately after the war in Europe are totally within the Western canon. Absolutely. And they follow from your distinction between modernism and modernity. There was no question that the Smithsons, in criticizing Corbusier, were not criticizing the idea of a modern architecture. They still wanted a modern architecture. Yes. And all the way through, I think, we're having a big conference tomorrow on Alan Cahoon's criticism. And he was all the way through a modernist, even though he understood the incursions of a kind of historical nostalgia that were emerging in postmodernism. So the modernity was still there as a flag that should push architecture, no matter which way.
Yeah. Do you think that we are still living in the shadow of modernism by even rejecting it? It's there. I mean, it's in the background.